While the cinema of the Soviet Union is mostly known internationally for their down-to-earth and often dour dramas, they also had a rich, vibrant history of producing fantasy films. They were usually colorful, lighthearted movies appropriate for children, but there were some darker, more adult fantasy films as well. Soviet fantasy contained lots of singing and dancing, and was often inspired by fairy tales and folklore. They were also usually not high fantasy that took place in a fully realized alternate world like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, but instead were mostly set in the Russia of various eras. The fantasy genre in the Soviet Union was dominated by two directors, and the first I'll discuss is Aleksandr Rou. During his directorial career that lasted from the 30s to the 70s, he mostly made adaptations of Russian folklore, fairy tales, or books, often combining more than one story into a single plot. Rou's films were very popular in the USSR, but his films barely got distributed in English-speaking countries. He used lots of weird, freakish-looking characters with grotesque over-the-top prosthetics and wigs. Rou also had several trademark simple special effects he used over and over, like double exposures and reverse footage. His work was very over-the-top in general, and some of his films are referred to as surrealist. Rou included many of the same actors and characters throughout his career, such as a grandmother-like character as narrator at beginning and end, or other iconic figures from Russian mythology like Baba Yaga. He also seemed to love using talking animals, especially bears. Soviet ideology certainly comes through in his plots, with lots of peasant characters and mockery of the rich. Rou's debut feature was The Magic Fish, also called Wish Upon a Pike, and released in 1938. This was the first Soviet fairy tale feature, and proved the skeptical communists wrong that were suspicious of fantasy being able to coexist with communist dogma. Obviously, Soviets were opposed to monarchy, and The Magic Fish mocks royalty with a senile and cruel czar, so the genre was now seen as compatible with Soviet ideology. Georgy Milyar plays the Tsar, and he would go on to appear in almost every Rou film going forward. The title references a talking fish that grants wishes, and Rou uses reverse footage to make the fish jump out of the water. The same technique makes logs magically leap into the hands of the protagonist. Like in so many of Rou's films, bears make an appearance, and one even picks up a trumpet and starts playing it. And we get some distinctly Russian cultural elements like accordion playing and the iconic squat dance. Rou's next was Vasilisa the Beautiful, which was released in 1939 as World War II was starting, and so unsurprisingly features defending the homeland as its main theme. A peasant has to rescue his fiancée from a three-headed dragon with magical powers that can shoot out water as well as fire from its mouths. The dragon is helped by an iconic figure of Russian mythology, Baba Yaga, played by Milyar, and appearing here for the first of her many appearances in Rou's films. As far as I can tell, this is the first appearance of the character in any live-action film. There's also a giant spider, and the protagonist has to fight a bear. The theme of making fun of the elite continues in this film, with the over-the-top ridicule of daughters of a nobleman, as one is a glutton and the other is stuck up. The score also stands out, and it contains a very early use of the theremin, an electronic music instrument invented in 1928. After that, The Humpbacked Horse was the first Soviet color fairy tale film, but shot in 2-strip color as opposed to the more realistic 3-color process dominant in Hollywood at the time. Like so many Soviet fantasy films, there's a talking animal as the titular horse speaks to the protagonist. The mythological creature known as the Firebird, which is well known in Slavic cultures, plays a key role as well. Again, a czar is portrayed as cruel and foolish and kidnaps the protagonist's love interest. Rou then directed Kashai the Immortal. The title character, played by Milyar, is a villain in Russian folklore who can only be defeated by destroying his hidden heart. Again, patriotism and defending the homeland are the main themes, explicitly stated with lines such as, "One should love his homeland more than his father or mother." Kashai the Immortal actually premiered the exact day that Germany officially surrendered to the Allies. The villain makes use of soldiers that look like Nazi troops, but there are also more standard fantasy elements like a magic carpet. Special effects are used to show tiny mushroom people in the same frame as a regular-sized human, as well as to show the title character's magic powers like growing back a new head. The film is so packed with singing and dancing that it's basically a musical, and again a character does the squat dance. The 1952 film May Nights was adapted from a short story set in the countryside by Nikolai Gogol, the iconic 19th century writer of the short stories The Nose and the Overcoat and the novel Dead Souls. The source material and movie both center on a Cossack, which is a member of a Slavic group from eastern Ukraine and southern Russia. The film was shot in full-color 3D and even blends animated elements with live action. This one has a little bit of a horror feel, with a witch, ghosts, and people wearing masks that make them look like demons, all playing a part. Rou began the 1960s with The Magic Weaver, where a boy searches for his mother, the titular weaver, who has been taken by a water spirit to an underwater kingdom with a villainous monarch. An underwater kingdom was a recurring trope in both Rou's films and Soviet fantasy in general, and talking bears made an appearance in The Magic Weaver as well. Rou's typical special effects also show up here, such as double exposure and distorted POV shots. Rou's next film was Cinderella, a straightforward adaptation of the 1945 Prokofiev ballet, with no dialogue whatsoever. However, it's not just a basic recording, as it does have close-ups mixed in with the wide shots. Members of the famous Bolshoi Ballet were part of the cast, so all the dancing is of a very high quality. Cinderella is just as visual effects heavy as the rest of Rou's films, and utilizes reverse footage and animation. In 1961, Rou again adapted Gogol for The Night Before Christmas. Like Cinderella, this film includes animation, although here it's not just in the opening credits, but rather the film proper just cuts to a cartoon for a brief scene. Also, like Cinderella and many Rou films, reverse footage is used as a special effect. Georgy Milyar plays a devil who causes blizzards, steals the moon, and is angry at a blacksmith for making a painting that mocks him. The blacksmith's mother is secretly a witch who flies around on a broom, and at one point grabs the stars out of the sky. Like the story it was based on, the film was set in Ukraine, lining up with Gogol's Ukrainian heritage. After that, Rou directed The Kingdom of Crooked Mirrors, which was based on a Russian novel from the 1950s. The film was about a bratty girl who meets her opposite while looking into a mirror. It's often compared to Alice in Wonderland due to the concept of a little girl being transported into a bizarre world. The crooked mirrors of the title make things appear not as they really are, and in a silly touch, the evil denizens of the mirror world all have names that are Russian words spelled backwards. As you might expect, the world is ruled by a stupid, cowardly king. It's also full of grotesque-looking characters with lots of prosthetics like fake noses and teeth. In 1964, Rou made a film that's referred to in the United States as Jack Frost, but bears little resemblance to that character. Like in Cachet the Immortal, there is a mushroom man, and here a peasant is turned into a bear for insulting him. Baba Yaga appears, and for the first time in Rou's filmography, she lives in the iconic house with chicken legs she inhabits in the folktales. Cats show up in a lot of Rou's films, and one is especially prominent in this one as Baba Yaga sends out a black cat to do her bidding. Jack Frost was the first of Rou's films to have an older lady introduce the film to the audience in the beginning, and she showed up in 4 more of his films. This won an award at the Venice Film Festival, but is mainly known among modern Americans for the edited and dubbed version that was made fun of on the TV series Mystery Science Theater 3000. Rou's next film, Fire, Water, and Brass Pipes, included both Cachet the Immortal and Baba Yaga, both played by Georgy Milyar. Special effects are used to make a wolf turn into a human and to show Cachet's rapid de-aging when he eats a magic apple. It's yet another film inspired by Slavic folklore, with a peasant boy and an immortal czar. We see a balalaika played, which is a Russian triangular stringed instrument that dates back to at least the 1600s. In the 1970 film Barbara the Fair with the Silken Hair, Milyar plays the leader of an underwater kingdom that demands from a czar whatever is in his land that the czar doesn't know about, which happens to be his unborn son. The plot is about children being swapped between a fisherman and the czar. Barbara the Fair uses this premise to mock royalty, as the czar's son is fat and spoiled. Like Fire, Water, and Brass Pipes, there's animation before the credits. Rou's final completed film was The Golden Horns, also known as Baba Yaga. In it, Baba Yaga transforms 2 girls into deer while mushroom hunting, after they were lured deep into the forest by forest spirits. The Golden Horns also has talking animals like a bear, deer, cat, and owl. Patriotism is again an important theme here, as one of the main characters uses magic Russian soil to transform into a Valkyrie and fight Baba Yaga. And in a cute touch that's distinctly Russian, the film uses the famous Russian nesting dolls to describe the family members. The other major filmmaker in the world of Soviet fantasy was Aleksandr Ptushko, who started in animation early in his career, then moved to live action for the vast majority of it. Like Rou, he was known for experimenting with special effects and adapting fairy tales and legends. Compared to Rou, his movies had a more epic feel, In fact, Ptushko used epic poetry as source material for a couple films. He was also known for his creative use of color and composition, and his films are quite visually impressive. It's also important to note that while multiple Ptushko films were shown on MST3K, as with Jack Frost, these were again the highly edited and dubbed versions, so they aren't representative of the quality of the originals. For his first feature film, The New Gulliver from 1935, Ptushko loosely adapted from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, but with added ideological content. The land of Lilliput is suffering from capitalist exploitation, and there's a subplot about workers going on strike. Depending on your definition, The New Gulliver is either one of or the earliest feature-length animated film, and is often referred to as the first stop-motion feature film. It combines live action with animation, sometimes even in the same scene, as the Lilliputians are all puppets, and Gulliver is a real boy. The New Gulliver was a large-scale production with over 3,000 puppets, with the main ones having 200 to 300 different heads for different facial expressions. In 1939, Ptushko followed that up with The Golden Key, another combination of stop-motion animation and live action, this time adapted from Pinocchio. The Golden Key is quite different from most adaptations of Pinocchio, as the plot about his nose growing when he lies is not included, nor does he become a real boy. The film also has extensive use of forced perspective to show people of different sizes in the same shot. Again, there's anti-capitalist messaging, as the villain is obsessed with money and treats his workers poorly. 7 years later came The Stone Flower, which was fully live action and one of the first Soviet colored features. It was based on folklore from the Ural region and uses a frame device of an old man telling a story. The plot is about a carving of a flower that is so beautiful people can't look away, and features peasants oppressed by an ugly, cruel landlord. In typical Soviet fantasy style, there's plenty of singing and dancing, and even a squat dance. The Stone Flower was a box office success and shown at the Cannes Film Festival, where it received an award for Best Use of Color. In 1953, Ptushko directed Sadko, which was based on the Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov opera and used his music as the score. The episodic film is about the title character searching for the bird of happiness. It contains a very patriotic message, as at the end, he finds out the real bird of happiness was his homeland all along. Plenty of typical Russian fantasy tropes are included, like lots of singing, an undersea kingdom, and the main character having to fight a bear, but also surreal elements like a bird with a woman's head. The title character travels the world, and parts of Sadko are set in India and Egypt. Sadko has no shortage of spectacle, with hundreds of extras, and an Indian prince carried on an elephant that Sadko has to defeat in chess. The film was very well received and even won the prestigious Silver Lion Award at the Venice Film Festival. His next film, The Sword and the Dragon, was the first Soviet widescreen film, and the first with stereo sound. The original title was Ilya Muromets, who was based on a character from Russian oral epic poetry who couldn't walk until he was magically healed and then given super strength. The character was a bogatyr, which was a stock character in Slavic folklore that was somewhat analogous to a knight-errant in Western Europe. The Sword and the Dragon was set in medieval times and mostly in Kiev. Like Sadko, there's plenty of spectacle, such as large battle scenes against invaders that are called Tugars, but are obviously supposed to be Mongols. The film also included thousands of extras, a 3-headed fire-breathing dragon, and a wind demon with prosthetic cheeks. It's also got the typical patriotism of Soviet fantasy, as there's lots of talk of defending Russia. After that, Ptushko directed Sampo, which was based on the Kalevala, a compilation of epic poetry that is considered the national myth of Finland. Sampo is a co-production with Finland, and they shot every scene 4 times, so it could be in both Russian and Finnish, as well as in 2 aspect ratios. Unsurprisingly, Sampo is full of songs and special effects like forced perspective. The titular object is a magic mill that can provide endless salt, gold, and grain, and can only be forged by the incredibly skilled blacksmith character. The villain is a sorceress who sends out a seemingly sentient cape to kidnap the heroine. Years later in 1966, we have Ptushko's The Tale of Tsar Saltan, adapted from a novel by Aleksandr Pushkin, the 19th century writer who is considered the founder of modern Russian literature. Like the 1831 fairy tale, the film is entirely spoken in rhyme. The Tale of Tsar Saltan tells a story of a czar choosing a wife from 3 sisters, and fantastical elements include a swan that turns into a princess, lion statues that come to life, and trolls. The following year saw the release of the film V, which was written but not directed by Ptushko. It contains fantasy tropes like witches, but the tone is more towards horror, and the film is often called the only Soviet horror movie. This isn't quite accurate, but horror was undeniably an extremely rare genre in the USSR. V is based on a Gogol short story, and has a surreal feel with lots of bizarre creatures. For his final film, Ptushko adapted Ruslan and Ludmila, a Pushkin fairy tale poem from 1820. Like The Sword and the Dragon, this film centers on a bogatyr, and he has to rescue his love from an evil wizard. The film climaxes with a battle full of bloodless violence, where people get their heads chopped off and even cut in half vertically, but somehow no blood or gore ever spills out. Ruslan even has to fight a tiger at one point. He also gets advice from a gigantic head, and various touches like that give the film a surreal tone. As with the tale of Tsar Sultan, the whole movie is in rhyme to reflect the source material. Director Mark Zakharov, who was known for his work in theater, also made several fantasy films in the 1970s and 80s. His style and tone was quite different from the films of Ptushko and Rou, as they were somewhat dark and less aimed towards children. In 1978, he directed An Ordinary Miracle, which is about a wizard who created a fairy tale, and the characters he created coming to life. Like so many Soviet fantasy films, a bear is involved, as one is magically transformed into a human. A few notable Russian actors are part of the cast, like Yevgeny Leonov, the voice of Soviet Winnie the Pooh, and Andrei Mironov, who starred in multiple popular comedies in the 60s and 70s. Zakharov's next movie, the very same Munchausen, was made for television and based on the Baron Munchausen character, a fictional nobleman created in the 1700s, and the inspiration for several other movies. The Baron makes up absurd stories that somehow always come true, to the consternation of his critics. For The House That Swift Built, Zakharov adapted a play about the famous Irish satirist Jonathan Swift. The plot is sprinkled with absurd elements like Swift putting on his own funeral every year despite not being dead. Yevgeny Leonov appears as a supposed giant that excuses his being of normal human size by claiming that he's just sunk low. His 1984 film Formula of Love also centers on a real person and features Count Cagliostro as the main character, who was a famous 18th century Italian magician and occultist. This serious, dour count is called upon by a wealthy young man to bring a statue to life. For his final film before the collapse of the USSR, Zakharov again adapted a play in To Kill a Dragon. The movie references Arthurian legend in having its main character be named Lancelot, a descendant of the famous knight. Lancelot must defeat a dragon, but in his subversive twist, the film becomes a satire of authoritarian regimes and what happens after they fall, when the power vacuum makes things even worse than they were before. While most of the popular Soviet fantasy movies were made by these directors, there are some other films worth mentioning as well. The 1967 film The Snow Queen adapts the fairy tale of the same name by Hans Christian Andersen, who actually appears as a character in the movie version. Christian elements are excised from the tale to align with the USSR's atheism. The Soviet Union even had their own version of The Little Mermaid in 1976. This is considerably different from the Disney version, as it doesn't include the plot of the title character losing her voice. I also have to discuss the bizarre curiosities that are the Soviet adaptations of the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. The first was the incredibly low-budget and crude live-action version of The Hobbit for television from 1985. It extensively uses chroma key compositing, more commonly known as green screen, and this makes the final result look absurdly fake and silly. Many important elements from the book are skipped, like the trolls and the visit to Rivendell. There's also no attempt to make the hobbits shorter than the rest of the cast, and Bilbo and Gandalf are of similar heights. 6 years later, a miniseries was produced for Soviet television based on the first book of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Consisting of 2 episodes for a total running time of just under 2 hours, it was only broadcast once, and then was considered a lost film until it resurfaced in 2021. Like the Soviet Hobbit, this was extremely low budget and used green screen throughout. The budget was so low that they couldn't even afford fireworks, and drawings were used to simulate them. This version was shot extremely quickly, in under a week, and they just used whatever props and costumes were available. This miniseries was the only visual adaptation that has included the character of Tom Bombadil until very recently with the Amazon Prime Rings of Power show. The USSR had a very successful animation industry which released several fantasy films, often taking from classic fairy tales and folklore, just like in live action. These began to be produced in the mid-1930s, and the first Soviet animated movie based on a classic fairy tale was The Tale of Tsar Durandai from 1934. It was directed by 3 iconic Soviet animators of the early era, the Brumberg sisters, and Ivan Ivanov Vano. The animated film features an anti-Tsarist plot where a foolish leader gets poisoned. A decade later, the Bromberg sisters directed The Tale of Tsar Saltan, taking from the same Pushkin novel as Ptushko did in the 1960s. The Tale of Tsar Saltan was again directed in 1984, and this time was co-directed by Ivanov Vano. This version used storybook-style backgrounds and folk art motifs. One of the most popular Soviet animated films was The Snow Queen, inspired by the same fairy tale as the live-action version, and released in 1957. Like a lot of Russian animation, it made use of an animation technique known as rotoscoping, where live-action footage is traced over frame by frame, allowing for more realistic-looking movement. However, in this film, rotoscoping was just used for the titular Snow Queen herself, and this was to give the queen an otherworldly feel, not for realism. The film won awards at multiple international festivals, and even got the unprecedented step of an American release, albeit with an entirely new soundtrack. The film was very well received in Japan as well. Even legendary anime director Hayao Miyazaki called The Snow Queen his favorite film, and said it had a big influence on his decision to do animation as a career. The Snow Queen's director, Lev Atamanov, also made The Key in 1961, which had basic backgrounds and partially sketched out environments. The satirical film had an odd combination of fantasy and sci-fi, with fairies, robots, a four-headed dragon, and a teleportation machine. The Wild Swans came out the following year and took inspiration from Hans Christian Andersen. The hour-long film is highly stylized with vibrant colors, and sometimes very simple backgrounds that are just a single solid color. The very flat-looking film mostly lacks movement and depth, or perspective in backgrounds, and doesn't attempt to give a realistic depiction of space. The film includes talking animals, and a witch uses a curse to transform people into swans. One non-Russian animator from the USSR was Estonian Rein Ramat, who made short films like the violent and surreal Toel the Great, which adapted an Estonian folktale about a mythical giant. I made a video entirely devoted to Soviet animation, which I'll link to in the description if you want to learn more. Clearly, the fantasy films of the Soviet Union stood out from the rest of the world. They were more rooted in tradition, folklore, and historical references compared to fantasy movies from the English-speaking world. There was more of an emphasis on visuals to make the fantasy worlds unique, instead of a complex fictional history. Even if you aren't interested in the subject matter, the beautiful imagery and a deeper understanding of Russian culture are great reasons to give these films a chance. If you're interested in checking these out further, many of these films are available to watch for free online on YouTube or archive.org. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.